Hello, everyone. My name is Nurilov, and I'm here to share the internet weather for this week. First off, we'll start with the top 10 most reports. This is a report showing scanning activity ordered by volume and the top 10 targeted ports ordered by volume. Now, if you've been a long-time viewer of the internet weather, you can kind of see that these ports don't really change much, especially the ones in the top 10. Especially for the last few months, they've kind of been the same. But one port I'd like to revisit today, which is port 22 TCP. This is normally associated with SSH brute forcing, so I'll show some charts a little bit later about this.
So, Stan, if I could digress here and I'm going to drag you out a little bit. 2375, what is that generally associated with? Because that's a new one to me.
2375 is one we've covered a few times in the past few weeks. It's there's this vulnerability in Docker orchestration tool. I forget the vendor, but basically what it allows you to do is there's a REST API, and when this appliance boots, right at that moment, it's vulnerable because it has this port open, and you can basically enumerate what the Docker containers are that are running, and you can launch your own Docker container. I'm pretty sure adversaries like this, and the reason is because you can run the Docker container of your choice, and you can do all kinds of things if you can run your own Docker container on someone else's machine. We've actually noticed a lot of advanced adversaries using tactics like this to obscure their geolocation or who the adversary really is. They do like to use compromised infrastructure, especially if they're an advanced adversary. So that's I forget the exact apply, but that's the bug. Sorry.
Yeah, so it suggests a growth in the desire to exploit cloud services as a means to facilitate other attack activities, right?
Yes, and that vulnerability is pretty old, I think. And there's a cousin port that goes along with this one. It's 2376. It's not in the top 10 this week, but it's in the top 20. And 2376 is the SSL version of this. I don't know why I did air quotes on SSL. It is SSL. I keep doing it. TLS. Maybe I'm trying to say TLS. It's the TLS version of the same protocol for the same appliance. So adversaries are scanning on both. Now, moving on, the top 10 most sources probing report. This is the report that I spend a lot of time looking at because it shows scanning activity by the number of IP addresses engaged in the scanning. And again, if you've been a long-time viewer of internet weather, you'll notice that this hasn't really significantly changed in the past few months. It's been pretty steady. You know, there's movement here or there by 1 or 2 ranking points. But the ports that we've been paying attention to the most have been port 8728 TCP, 8291 TCP, and today also port 22 TCP. And that's because they're related to exploitation of microtik routers. Now, microtik routers, and we've mentioned several times on the internet weather, they've been a target for some time by several different kinds of adversaries, including advanced ones. And it basically allows adversaries to do something special. So I want to review the scanning activity that we've been observing over time. And we actually had a chance to investigate this a little bit more in depth. We actually took the time and we set up a special purpose honeypot for microtik routers. And we actually figured out a little bit more of what's going on than we had been able to in the past. So I'd like to share that with our viewers today. Important to note here, if you look at the scanning activity, these 3 ports, they're associated with 22 is multifaceted. Multiple adversaries are using and targeting this port. But today, I was able to kind of tie that back together. So these 3 ports you could see represent, that looks about like 25% of the top scanned ports, or all the scanned ports that we're seeing. So it's pretty significant, the amount of scanning happening to target these microtik devices. So first off, I'd like you to look at the activity over the last 2 years for scanning against port 22 TCP. And this is the number of IP addresses engaged in the scanning. Now, for long-term watchers of internet weather, they can kind of look at this and see something interesting. And what is that interesting thing that they'll be able to see? Well, if you look at the scanning activity kind of pre-December 23rd, let's say, you'll notice that the peaks and valleys, they're kind of together. There's no peaks and valleys. But after, let's say, the 23rd of December, there's a lot of peaks and valleys. Usually, when we see exploitation and scanning activity, especially if it's like related to like a constant threat or some sort of a botnet, that's like an IoT botnet, let's say, the scanning is pretty flat. That is, the types of computers engaged in this, they never go offline. They're constantly staying there. But something happened on, I guess, December 23rd-ish, which is you see the peaks and valleys start to emerge. Now, usually that happens when a device is coming on and offline. So we're looking at aggregate scanning activity. That means there's a lot of data represented here, a lot of different kinds of devices. So when you see that, that actually represents, I wouldn't say human activity, but more assets related to computers that most people would normally use. So
Yeah,
it's not a server.
It's showing a very clear indication of the business week, that the weekends are there and the time in the evening is off.
Yeah, exactly. By the way, my headset might have gone out. Is it still clear?
You're good.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Sorry, I just didn't want to talk like a robot, although maybe that would have been fun. So let me pick it back up.
No, you're good.
Yes, exactly. All right. So moving on, I'd like you to kind of remember this picture as I move on to the next one. This is the scanning activity for port 8291 TCP. Now, if you look carefully, it's not as, let's say, high in volume as port 22, but the number of IP addresses engaged in the scanning is like so correlated. You see those two huge spikes in 2020. You see the picking up of like this daily scan volume right around, actually this one is even clearer, December 23rd, 2020. And the same you'll see on the next port, 8728. They're like identical. These profiles, if I had to make a DNA signature for scanning activity, this is it. This uniquely identifies it. And even though on port 22 the activity is different, this is on top of whatever is normal for port 22, and you can kind of see it pretty clearly, I would say. So, like I mentioned before, we decided to set up a honeypot, and we spent a lot of time looking at the results. I guess before I get into that, this is the IP addresses on a world map of some of the recent scanners that we've observed participating in the scanning. And you could see that the scanning against MikroTik on the two ports, 8728 and 8291, is worldwide, except for one region that usually you would also see lit up. Like I don't see a lot of scanning activity emanating out of Asia, which to me is very interesting because you usually get at least a few in every country. But just the volume of scanning activity and the IP address and dispersion, it's worldwide. It's happening everywhere except, I guess, one Asian country.
Yeah, specifically China. So but it is very heavy in Asia, actually very heavy in Asia. And although the population is denser there, that has some explanation associated with it, it's notably not as dense in the United States. I mean, relatively speaking, that's actually a little surprising to me just looking at this. And just for clarity, I'm sure most people understand this, but this is looking at the sources of the scanning activity, implying that it's a device that's infected and trying to find other devices that are infected, right?
Yes, exactly. So now we took a closer look at this and we said, well, what does the honeypot tell us? And after setting up a honeypot and letting it go live, with so many scanners out there, we saw our first beacon probably within the first 10 minutes. Somebody attempted to exploit this device. And this is the message that they sent. Now, it's interesting, they're using very specific path names and they're using very specific domains. So this is where we apply threat intelligence, tradecraft, and try to hunt and see what's the same about it. What we discovered, and thanks a lot to research also from others on the internet, there is a Windows botnet written in the Go programming language called, I think most detection names are random bot, We still don't understand how it's distributed. It looks like it might be distributed maybe with a different infection or dropped as part of some other already existing infection there. And it's also sometimes, especially in 2020, was associated with the Glupteba botnet. Glupteba just sounds like such a Russian term. For some reason, glup is like the root of the word, let's say glupus, like unsophisticated or something, like somebody who makes a mistake or something like that. So it makes me wonder if it was named maybe after people like clicking on software that maybe they shouldn't have downloaded, like a Trojan or something like that. Like maybe looking for some, like a illegal software download or Trojan or some kind of like a cheat in a game, and being tricked into downloading this threat. Again, there's not a lot of literature on how this spreads, and we still have to study this more, but it's clear after reversing the malware a little bit that this Windows component is actually the one responsible for the scanning and exploitation against these ports. And what's more interesting is if you combine it with the charts that we saw, you could see that it follows that pattern, right? The weekly pattern with the weekends and the nights and the days. Why? Because it's impacting devices that people use. A lot of Windows computers, especially ones where you trick a user for a game cheat or something like that, it's probably something that someone is using.
So this, I'm going to guess that this is running it in some sort of mode that when the device goes to sleep, it goes to sleep as well, as opposed to, it doesn't keep the device alive. It
seems like that's what's happening, yes. And I think that's why we're seeing that pattern with the computers going down and such. Mm-hmm. So important, I kept mentioning this date of December 23rd like a lot. And clearly this threat, the way it existed, I see a lot of references to it from other security researchers in 2020, like early 2020 as Glupteba botnet. And after December 23rd, we found a sample that looks like it was the first sample ever of this, and it was labeled, luckily, December 23rd, 2020. It had the date in there, the specific date, and it's interesting because that is the date that it seems like all of this scanning activity has been found. So we kind of, like I mentioned before, we use these mistakes that adversaries make to kind of catch them and detect them doing something interesting. Mm-hmm. So what happens with all this and what else can you do? Well, again, we rely on different techniques to find this malware, download it, and et cetera, and find other samples even dating back. Doing that, we noticed that, again, this is something that others have observed as well out there in the open source, the importance of sharing information. There's a couple of different payloads being downloaded, and I'll just show you a few of them. So one of the payloads that's being downloaded sets up, basically secures the device, so it stops all the possible exploitation. It closes all the exploitation ports down. And then it opens up ports allowing SOC access for specific IP address ranges. Now, we've already examined before MikroTik exploitation, and it does look like, for example, TrickBot, a well-known botnet, is using MikroTik routers as part of their infrastructure. So it's a layered botnet, and MikroTik is kind of like one of the first steps in that layer, so this compromised infrastructure. And this is an example of somebody setting up these tunnels or allowing access to devices out of these ranges. Now, it's interesting because if you map it out, the high percentage of them are in just 4 countries here, but really many are in the RU region. So that's interesting. In fact, one specific provider. So if you look up an Aaron who owns these IP addresses, you'll get a couple of different things, but a lot of them will be one provider. So that is meaningful. That usually indicates, again, when you're thinking about the evolution of the adversary and what they're doing, It's showing you a little bit about, this is when they were not hiding themselves as much. Next is, these are the payloads that we've also observed. So these are some other things that they have done in the past, and the first one is actually the current payload. So the first one opens a port 5678 and establishes that as a SOX proxy, but it no longer uses like an access list. So pretty much anyone can access this port, it seems, and use the device as a SOX proxy. The next two examples are, I guess, at an earlier part of the campaign when the adversary was using VPN to establish a tunnel. So their client, so the infected microtik would actually connect to this VPN service. And again, what I found interesting about this is whoever this adversary is, I mean, hopefully you can tell, it's pretty complicated what they're doing. They got a Windows botnet that they're distributing in some yet unknown way. We think it's through Trojanized apps. They're using that to scan for these microtik devices. Then they're setting up a SOX proxy on these microtik devices or connecting to VPN. You know, that requires domain name registrations. They're using a DDoS provider also to prevent themselves from being DDoS. So all this kind of costs, I would say, money, right? Like it costs money to get IP address space. It costs money to get hosting. So all of this is kind of happening. It's showing me that this adversary, whoever they are, understands how the internet works, understands how security researchers work, and understands, you know, a lot about the infrastructure and very well resourced. So they must have some money, some profit in order to continue hosting this infrastructure. So that's it for now. We'll keep you posted as our research continues. But some really, really interesting findings. You know, it's one of the times where we go from just understanding that scanning is happening to really being able to explore it in depth with the use of like a honeypot or something like that to get that additional context about what's happening.
Yeah.
And as we learn more, hopefully we'll be able to share the findings as well with the community. Yeah.
Awesome, Stan. So this is some good research here, some good explanation about the sort of the history and the activity around this particular set of activities. Do you have an idea of what this botnet gets used for? And it obviously is a pretty good footprint. Is it, do you anticipate it's used for DDoS attacks, or what do you think?
Right now we're seeing, so it looks like there's a couple of different components. So the microtik component, it seems to be used as compromised infrastructure. So adversaries use it to relay C2 traffic for things like TrickBot. So a lot of TrickBot C2 servers are actually microtik routers that are then forwarding their connection somewhere else and somewhere else to make it hard to detect the adversary. So this seems to be it primarily. But if you think about a SOX proxy and what it allows, basically allows anonymous access through some device. So it seems like there might be even 2 or 3 different like adversaries at play. You know, the distribution mechanism for infecting the routers, like someone who's running this, you know, SOX proxy distributed service out there. And then finally, maybe the people taking advantage of the SOX proxy service. So still more to figure out on this end, but it doesn't seem like it's used for, it doesn't really seem like it's used for DDoS. It seems more like it's used for these special operations of hiding where you're coming from.
Okay, that's pretty big botnet for that kind of purpose, but certainly fits within the context of how some of these botnets get used, that to be able to facilitate anonymization activities and to you know, it's hard to tell what else might be done through those you know, through those SOX proxies.
Yeah, we'll keep an eye on it and we'll try to figure out a little bit more about what's happening here.
All right, nice job. Thank you for sharing that, Stan, and look forward to the next Internet Weather Report with an elaboration on what's going on here.